Jasmine Crockett thought she was walking into a routine debate, but one question from Candace Owens changed everything. What started as a political back and forth turned into a viral moment of silence that stunned millions by the end of the night. One voice stood firm, while the other had no words left. Stick around to see the moment that shook the whole country. And before we begin, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you never miss this moment. Two women, both fierce in their convictions, sat across from each other. One carried the confidence of political power, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The other, Candace Owens, brought a fire forged from years of unapologetic truth-telling. The host gave the usual introduction, the kind people forget 5 seconds after it's said, but everyone knew this wasn't going to be a routine debate. The tension was already in the air. Jasmine smiled, poised and ready. Candace looked focused, calm hands folded in front of her. She wasn't here to make noise, she was here to cut deep with facts. Tonight we're talking race, justice, and the American system, the host said. Let's start with policing. The moment the word policing hit the air, Jasmine leaned in. Already in motion, we've seen systemic abuse for decades. Jasmine began. Communities of color have been targeted, overpoliced, and ignored. When they cry out, that's not opinion, it's reality. Applause. Candace waited, let it breathe, and then in a voice so steady, it almost threw Jasmine off. Do you believe personal responsibility plays any role in outcomes within those communities? Jasmine blinked. Excuse me, she said, narrowing her eyes. Candace didn't flinch. I'm asking if it's possible that two truths can exist, that systemic issues may be real, but so is the need for individual accountability. Jasmine let out a soft laugh, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. That sounds great on a podcast, she said, her voice dipping with sarcasm, but that's not how real life works for the people I represent. Candace leaned forward now, just slightly. Well, I read about a case. You were involved in a police brutality case. You were the defense attorney. Your client said they were beaten by officers, but you told them to settle quietly. The room tightened. Jasmine shifted in her seat. That's not relevant, she snapped. That case had layers you wouldn't understand. But it is relevant, Candace said, not raising her voice, because you stood for justice in public, but advised silence in private. Is that justice, or is that political survival? For a moment Jasmine didn't speak. The host tried to step in. Let's keep this focused on the broader issue. No, Jasmine cut in, trying to wrest control. This isn't about me, it's about the people who suffer every day in this system. Candace nodded. And I care about those people. That's why I'm asking, when leaders like you compromise in silence, who's left to speak for them now? The audience was still not a breath. The battle lines had just been drawn, and the show was only 5 minutes in. Candace didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She simply leaned back. Jasmine, on the other hand, was already fuming. She wasn't just being challenged, she was being exposed. But she wasn't going down without a fight. What came next would send the entire panel, the audience, and the internet into a frenzy, and the most unforgettable moment. It hadn't even happened yet. Jasmine Crockett wasn't new to confrontation on the House floor, in committee hearings, on social media. She'd battled critics before, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't just sparring with an opposing viewpoint. She was sitting across from a mirror that didn't flinch. Candace had barely said a dozen sentences, but every one of them landed like a quiet punch. I'm not here to relitigate my legal history, Jasmine said sharply. I did what was best for my client. That's what good attorneys do. Candace tilted her head slightly. But if the system is so broken, why not fight it in court? Why silence the story? Why walk away? Jasmine's hands clasped together tightly on the table. Because you don't always win in court, she said, especially when the system stacked against you. We had to be strategic. Candace's voice was steady. So the solution is to settle and move on rather than expose the abuse. Jasmine's jaw flexed. Don't sit there and act like you understand what it's like to be a black woman representing someone who's been beaten half to death by a badge. I don't have to imagine, Candace said. I've lived in communities where justice is delayed and denied. That's why I speak out, not just when it's easy, but when it's unpopular. What I don't do is bury the truth when it's inconvenient. That hit hard. Jasmine's tone shifted. She raised her voice just a little. You know what you are, Candace. Convenient, you say, just enough to sound thoughtful, but never enough to challenge the systems that built your platform. Candace didn't blink. If calling for accountability in our communities is controversial, maybe the issue isn't me now. The host was scrambling to maintain order. We're diving deep tonight, he said, trying to inject some calm. Let's steer the conversation back to reform proposals. Jasmine ignored him. Now you want to pivot, she said, eyes locked on Candace. Let's talk about your cozy relationship with conservatives who want to gut education and voting rights. You think that helps our people? Candace smiled faintly. I think telling the truth helps everyone. And sometimes the hardest truth is that we keep recycling outrage while nothing changes. What we need is courage, not slogans. Murmurs in the audience. The control room's red light blinked. Show producer signaling a commercial was near. But nobody was looking away from the screen. The moment had crystallized. Jasmine leaned forward, no tapping her fingers on the desk. You think you're clever, but I know your playbook. You stir up controversy, go viral, cash in, and move on. Candace responded without flinching. And you build your career on grievance politics while hoping no one looks too closely at your past decisions. Boom. That was it, the sentence that shifted the energy in the room. Jasmine opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out right away. Her eyes darted first to the host, then to the audience, then back to Candace. It wasn't rage that filled her face now, it was uncertainty. Candace had touched something deeper than talking points. She'd reached back into Jasmine's record and held up a contradiction for everyone to see, and Jasmine knew it. The cameras rolled. The silence lingered. The commercial break couldn't come fast enough. As the show faded to commercial, Jasmine reached for her water, but didn't drink. Her hand hovered for a moment, fingers gripping the bottle, knuckles pale. Her mic was muted, but the tension in her eyes said everything. Candace, still calm, looked down at her notes, flipping one page. If she hadn't just knocked the air out of a sitting congresswoman, producers bustled just off stage. Someone adjusted the lights. The host leaned forward to whisper something to both guests. Jasmine nodded slightly, though her gaze never left Candace. She was recalibrating. The first round hadn't gone as planned, and she knew the viewers noticed. Back from break, the host offered a forced smile. We're back with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and political commentator Candace Owens. Let's dive into the topic of criminal justice reform and what that actually looks like moving forward. Jasmine jumped in before the question fully landed. Let me be clear, she said, voice sharper. Now I've dedicated my life to fighting injustice. I've marched, I've drafted legislation, I've worked cases pro bono. My record speaks for itself. Candace looked up again. Does it speak for itself, or does it hide behind press releases and safe talking points? That was a cut Jasmine couldn't let sit. Oh please, she snapped. Don't confuse your social media stunts with real advocacy. Candace leaned in, her voice low and surgical. I'm not here to trend. I'm here to tell the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable, especially people in power. Jasmine leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. You mean people like me? Candace nodded. Exactly. There it was. Not yelling, not theatrics, just a direct challenge delivered like a truth no one else was willing to say out loud. The studio was quiet again. Jasmine adjusted her mic, clearing her throat. You think you figured me out because you read headlines and old court documents, but I've seen things you haven't. I've held mothers who lost their sons to police violence. I've walked into jail cells to represent people who were broken before they even got to court. Candace responded immediately. And yet, when those stories threatened your political future, you backed away. That's not leadership, that's calculation. The audience shifted. You could feel the room tipping, unsure where to land. Jasmine's voice broke slightly. You don't know what it's like to be the only black woman in a room full of lawmakers who don't care if your people live or die. Candace soft, and just for a moment, you're right, I don't sit in Congress, but I know what it's like to be alone in a room full of people who hate you just for telling the truth. It wasn't angry, it wasn't smug, it was honest. That tone confused Jasmine for a beat. She'd prepared for attack, for heat, for noise. She hadn't prepared for precision or poise. This wasn't the Candace she thought she'd debate. This was someone who knew how to speak through the camera, past the host, past the panel, straight to the people watching at home. And that audience, they weren't just watching anymore, they were rethinking everything. Candace wasn't winning with volume, she was winning with clarity, and Jasmine's usual armor, passion, identity, experience wasn't shielding her the way it used to. The cracks had begun to show, but the unraveling that was still to come. Candace waited. She could have pressed harder, she could have gone for the knockout punch, but instead she let the silence linger. She knew Jasmine was unraveling herself, word by word. The host, sensing the rising discomfort, tried again to steer the conversation. Congresswoman, what do you say to critics who feel your legal past contradicts your public advocacy? Jasmine's smile tightened. She nodded, as if mentally preparing her defense. There was a case in Dallas. Young man claimed excessive force. Yes, I represented him. Yes, we settled. But that decision wasn't cowardice, it was compassion. He couldn't relive that trauma in court. Candace didn't interrupt. She waited for the moment Jasmine felt safe. Then she said quietly, his name was Raylan Monroe. The air shifted. Jasmine froze. She hadn't said the name, she hadn't planned to. She hoped no one remembered it. Candace did. He told reporters he was pressured to settle, that he wanted to speak, to stand in court, but was told it would hurt the cause. That's what you said to him, right? Jasmine's eyes narrowed. That's not public record, she said carefully. Candace nodded. No, but he said it. And when he was asked why he gave in, he said he trusted you. Now the camera zoomed in. Jasmine's jaw was tight, but she kept her tone measured. Candace, what you're doing is irresponsible. You're using a single case, one you were never involved in, to assassinate my character. I'm holding you to your own standard. Candace replied, you built your platform on justice, but when justice got complicated, you chose silence. The host jumped in, voice stiff with urgency. We need to keep names protected. If no, Jasmine said quickly. It's fine, she turned back to Candace. I think you're exposing me, but all you're doing is reminding people how hard these decisions are. It's easy to sit there and talk about truth. It's harder when someone's life is in your hands. Candace nodded. I agree. But that's why the truth matters more than the politics. If we start compromising there, we lose everything. The audience, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed dead silent. Jasmine's voice dropped an octave. You don't know what it's like to be responsible for someone else's future, to see the system chew them up, and know you can't fix it, only soften the blow. Candace's voice didn't rise, it never did, but you can tell the truth, and when leaders don't, when they play safe, they betray the people they say they serve. That was the fracture. It wasn't rage, it wasn't shouting, it was reality cutting through rhetoric. Jasmine suddenly looked smaller, not weak, just exposed. Her usual armor, resistance, identity, passion felt less like a shield and more like a story she was struggling to hold on to. Candace looked across the table. Do you regret how that case ended? Jasmine paused. It was the one question she hadn't prepared for, and it showed. The pause was everything. It stretched long enough to feel like an answer in itself, and that pause, looped and replayed, would soon spread across social media like wildfire. That silence, it didn't just live in the studio, it exploded beyond it. Within minutes of airing, clips of the exchange were all over X, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, one in particular, Candace asking, do you regret how that case ended, followed by Jasmine's long, breathless pause, was going viral. Before the segment had even finished broadcasting, the hashtags were brutal. Crockett cornered Hasha Owens, Unfiltered Shash, say his name. Raylan producers whispered into the host's earpiece as real-time metrics lit up backstage. Jasmine's team, seated just behind the set, were already tapping furiously on phones, crafting statements, drafting deflections. But inside the studio, time moved differently. It was still Jasmine and Candace, two women locked in an ideological collision. Neither could walk away from the host. Tried again. He had to. It was his job. Congresswoman, you don't have to answer that last question, but I think the audience deserves clarity. Jasmine straightened her shoulders, pushing through. I did what I thought was best at the time. I don't regret protecting my client. I regret that people twist that decision to score points. Candace's expression didn't change. No one's twisting anything, they're just watching. Jasmine's voice cracked just slightly. Well, maybe that's the problem. People are too busy watching, judging from the outside instead of doing the work. You're right, Candace replied. Too many people are watching, but that's because too many in power stop listening. That line landed like a thunderclap. Even the host had nothing. Jasmine tried to pivot. She had to reframe the narrative. We can debate tactics all day, but at the end of the day, I've passed legislation. I fought for police reform. What have you done? Candace replied instantly, I've given people permission to think for themselves, without apology, without fear. The audience applauded, not wild cheers, just the sound of people acknowledging what they'd just seen, something real. Jasmine forced a smile. It didn't hold. She reached again for her water bottle, but still didn't drink. Then let's ask the people, she said, gesturing toward the camera, if they believe tearing down black women who are trying to make a difference helps our cause, then maybe I'm in the wrong fight. Candace paused, then delivered the most cutting response yet, with zero malice. No one's tearing you down, but if the only way you can stand is by shielding yourself from accountability, maybe you're standing in the wrong place. There it was, the shift, the energy turn, not chaotic, just final. Candace had walked Jasmine step by step into a corner, and then simply stopped, letting the silence do the rest. The host shuffled his notes, visibly relieved. The segment was almost over. We'll be back after this final break. Stick with us. There's still more to come. The screen faded to black, but for the millions watching, they already knew the real show had just ended, and only one person left the table with their story intact. The second the cameras cut to commercial, Jasmine turned her chair slightly away from Candace, not enough to be obvious, but enough to signal she was done. Her jaw was tight, her eyes flicked to her team behind the set. They didn't make eye contact. Candace, meanwhile, remained still, no fist pumping, no celebration, just calm. She knew what had just happened. She hadn't humiliated Jasmine, she had revealed her. Backstage, producers huddled around a monitor replaying the moment where Jasmine couldn't answer. The clip had already hit 1 million views online. A prominent journalist posted a side-by-side Jasmine's 2020 rally speech about fighting in the courtroom for justice next to Candace's quote, what happens when that courtroom gets uncomfortable. The contrast was brutal. On the panel's final segment, the host tried to cool things down. He invited closing thoughts. Candace spoke first. Look, I didn't come here to tear anyone down, but I do believe truth matters, more than branding, more than careers. And I believe real justice means owning not just what's popular, but what's right. Then she paused before continuing. We keep demanding change from the system, but we also have to demand integrity from the people who represent us. The words weren't loud, but they hit hard. Then it was Jasmine's turn. She cleared her throat. It's easy to be a critic from a distance. It's harder to lead. I've made choices, some painful, some public, but I've always made them with the people in mind. She looked straight Into the camera trying to reclaim ground. I won't apologize for doing my job even when others don't understand it. That was her final line, but it didn't land the way she'd hoped because the issue wasn't that people didn't understand her. The issue was they suddenly did. As the show wrapped, the host gave the obligatory thank yous and sign-offs. The credits rolled, the theme music played, but no one was watching that. They were watching their phone screens, flooded with comments. She folded under pressure. Candace didn't even raise her voice. That's what made it lethal. I used to admire Jasmine, now I have questions. A live poll flashed across social media. Who made the stronger case? Candace Owens 81%, Jasmine Crockett 13%, undecided 6%. It wasn't just a loss, it was a landslide, and Jasmine knew it. As she left the studio, she pulled her blazer tighter around her. Reporters were already outside. Her staff flanked her, blocking questions. Flashbulbs popped. A few shouted, "Do you regret settling the Monroe case?" Others asked, "Did Owens cross a line?" Jasmine didn't answer. She walked faster inside. Candace left through the back quiet exit. No cameras, no entourage, just a silent ride to her next destination, knowing that what had just unfolded wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning, and the ripple effects, they were only beginning. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Crockett crumbles under Owens questioning. The moment that broke the studio. Candace Owens dismantles the narrative. Live and Unfiltered, a debate or a dissection. Viewers react to viral exchange. Jasmine Crockett's team was already in full crisis mode. An emergency Zoom call was underway. Before sunrise, staffers scrambled to draft responses, flag past interviews, and plot a narrative pivot. The goal was clear: turn vulnerability into strength. We frame it as emotional authenticity. One aide said, "People connect with imperfection." No, another argued, "We redirect focus on her legislative wins, make it about action over words." Jasmine sat silently, arms crossed, staring at the footage. Paused on her laptop. That one moment, her pause looped across every platform. It wasn't just a pause anymore, it was the pause, a symbol. She knew she had to respond, but the timing had to be perfect, not rushed, not too late. Meanwhile, Candace had already moved on. She wasn't tweeting about the exchange. She didn't need to. The internet was doing it for her. Clips were being shared by figures on both sides of the aisle. Commentators on mainstream networks, who usually dismissed Candace, were grudgingly admitting she had struck a chord. Podcasters dissected the debate line by line. TikTok creators lip-synced her quotes. Raylan Monroe's name was trending again, alongside photos of him from that settled case, now re-examined by a public suddenly hungry for context. What started as a debate about justice was becoming something else. It was about trust. Who could you believe who actually stood for something? Later that afternoon, Jasmine appeared on a live stream from her office. No blazer this time, just a soft cardigan and a carefully set expression. "I want to talk to you not as a congresswoman, but as a woman who's fought this system from the inside," she began. She spoke about trauma, about the burden of leadership, about imperfect decisions. "In a world full of impossible choices, I did settle that case," she admitted, "because sometimes protecting someone means protecting them from further pain. I stand by that choice, but I also hear you. I hear the disappointment, and I welcome the scrutiny." She paused, then leaned closer. "I'm not here to be perfect, I'm here to serve." It was well-crafted, emotional, thoughtful, but it didn't undo the previous night. Comments on the live stream were split. "She's human, she owned it, too little too late." She didn't answer the real question. Would she do it again? Meanwhile, Candace gave a short interview on a podcast later that day. She said she welcomes scrutiny. Candace remarked, "Good, because that's what accountability looks like, not just when cameras are off, but when the pressure's highest." The host asked if Candace felt she went too far. She paused, then replied, "Telling the truth isn't cruelty, it's clarity. If our leaders can't handle that, maybe they shouldn't lead." Simple, direct, and devastating. The narrative had shifted, not just for Jasmine Crockett, but for everyone watching, because the debate wasn't just about two women, it was about something deeper. Can someone stand for justice if they've run from hard truths? And more importantly, would the public ever look at Jasmine the same way again? By the time Congress resumed session that week, the debate was already echoing through Capitol Hill. Reporters waited outside committee rooms, not for legislative updates, but to catch a glimpse of Jasmine Crockett, and not a single camera lens could ignore the elephant in the room. The debate with Candace Owens was now a political earthquake, and Jasmine was standing in the aftershock. Some of her Democratic colleagues offered quiet words of support, hushed tones in hallways, a quick hand on the shoulder, but even those gestures felt calculated. Behind closed doors, the whispers had started. "She should have never agreed to that debate." Candace didn't yell. That's what made it lethal. Jasmine lost control of the narrative. That's the real damage. And a few friendly pundits began hedging their loyalty. "She's a rising star, sure, but last night reminded us rhetoric has to be backed by courage back home." In her district, local radio hosts debated whether Crockett's national moment had become a liability, And the most painful criticism wasn't from conservatives, it came from people who once campaigned for her "you can't stand on justice" and fold under pressure, said one caller. "We voted for backbone, not spin." Meanwhile, Candace Owens stayed silent. No follow-ups, no victory lap, just one pinned tweet. The truth defends itself, the rest falls apart under pressure. The tweet had nearly 3 million likes. Political commentators now wondered aloud, was this Candace's crossover moment? For years, she had been framed as a provocateur, but this time she hadn't provoked, she had simply asked, and Jasmine had unraveled on her own the most compelling narratives. After all, are the ones where the audience witnesses the truth come to light, without being forced, and that's exactly what happened. But what no one expected was what came next. A coalition of civil rights attorneys released a public statement. Justice must be loud, but it must also be honest. They didn't mention Jasmine by name, but they didn't have to. Within 24 hours, a long dormant petition began circulating calling for the re-examination of the Marilyn Monroe case and others like it, not because of legal misconduct, but because of ethical shortcuts. The movement wasn't aimed at Jasmine alone. It was bigger than her. Now Candace had pulled one thread, and suddenly the seams across the entire political performance were unraveling. The public had questions, the press wanted answers, and Jasmine, she was learning that even if you survive the viral moment, it doesn't mean you walk away unmarked in politics. Momentum is everything. 1 week ago, Jasmine Crockett was on the rise, booked on national shows, praised as a fiery new voice in Congress. Now she was navigating a media firestorm that refused to fade. But something strange began to happen. Not all the coverage was critical. A wave of progressive activists, especially younger voters, started reframing the incident not as a defeat, but as a lesson in humanity. Some defended Jasmine's pause, others posted think pieces titled "The Cost of Expecting Perfection from Black Women in Power." Candace won the debate, but lost the people. Why vulnerability isn't weakness? The digital tide wasn't reversing, but it was shifting. Jasmine's team noticed. They leaned in, amplifying the authenticity narrative. Suddenly, the tone of her public posts changed, less defensive, more reflective. She posted a photo of her childhood home with a caption, "Before politics, before law school, I was just a girl trying to survive in a system built to break us. Sometimes survival means compromise. I never claimed to be perfect, I only promised to fight, and I still will." That post went viral too, but for a different reason. Not for what it said, but for what it didn't. It didn't address Candace, it didn't mention Marilyn Monroe, it didn't answer the question, and the silence started speaking louder again. Meanwhile, Candace gave one final interview, short, calm, and powerful. "I never asked for an apology, I asked for an answer," she said. And the truth is, leaders don't need to be perfect, but they do need to be honest when it matters most. The interviewer asked her what she hoped people took away from the debate. Candace didn't hesitate. "I hope they remember that the truth doesn't shout, it waits." That quote lit up everywhere. It became a caption, a t-shirt, even a headline. And Jasmine, she was stuck in a strange space, not cancelled, not fully redeemed, just floating, caught between empathy and expectation. She returned to Capitol Hill and resumed her duties, but everything felt different. Reporters still followed her, but now the questions were sharper. Would you handle that case differently today? Do you believe you lost control of the narrative? Is the system broken, or are its champions just tired? Jasmine answered, but always carefully. She still hadn't said Marilyn Monroe's name, and that was the wound that wouldn't close, because despite all the reframing, all the damage control, and all the shifting media winds, one fact remained: Candace Owens didn't win that debate with volume, she won it with a question that was never answered. And in today's world, where spin dominates everything, a moment of silence sometimes speaks loudest. The story wasn't just about who spoke better, it was about who stood firmer when the spotlight burned hottest. And Jasmine Crockett, bright, bold, brilliant, had blinked. Weeks passed, the outrage faded, but the echo never fully left. Cable shows moved on, the headlines shifted, but the clip, the moment Jasmine paused and the world leaned in, never stopped circulating. It became part of the digital archive, a reference point in political discourse, a cautionary tale. And yet something deeper lingered, not about Jasmine, not even about Candace, but about us, because that night wasn't just a clash between two women, it was a referendum on honesty, on how leaders respond when stripped of applause, script, and safety in private. Jasmine's aides still debated whether she should have answered the question directly. They ran scenarios, crafted alternate responses, but no draft could erase what millions had already seen. The moment she hesitated, and the silence that answered for her. Candace, meanwhile, didn't ride the wave. She didn't release a book. She didn't flood the airwaves. She stayed quiet, letting the moment do what it was always meant to do: reveal. She didn't need a post-debate tour. She didn't need to gloat, because for those watching closely, the real power of that night wasn't the argument, it was the contrast. Candace never raised her voice. She never accused, she asked, and in doing so she uncovered something bigger than a contradiction. She uncovered a truth about modern politics, how it's built on appearances, carefully rehearsed identities, and an allergic reaction to vulnerability. But the public is changing. They're not asking for perfect answers anymore. They're asking for real ones. That's what Jasmine didn't give. That's what Candace exposed. And in the end, that's what turned a fiery political back and forth into a turning point. Rylan Monroe's name is now part of a new push for transparency in legal settlements involving public officials. A bipartisan committee is exploring legislative proposals requiring disclosure in certain civil rights cases. Candace's quiet question had started a ripple that reached the law itself. As for Jasmine, she remains in office, still a voice in the halls of Congress, still working, still showing up. But something's changed. She speaks more cautiously now. She avoids live panels. She turns down debates. She learned that it wasn't the camera that burned her, it was the question she wasn't ready for. And for Candace, she moved on. She never tried to define Jasmine's career. She never needed to, because when the truth is spoken clearly, it doesn't chase people, it waits patiently until the next moment comes, the next debate, the next face behind the podium, the next person who says they speak for the people, until someone asks what happens when the people ask them to speak clearly in return. That's the real legacy of the moment. Not destruction, not humiliation, but exposure. And in the final frame of this story, the cameras are off, the lights are down, to chairs sit across from each other in an empty studio. One chair holds silence, the other still holds the question, and it's waiting for whoever comes next.